Max paced nervously in the sleek, sterile lobby of the alien embassy. The walls shimmered with a soft iridescence, a far cry from the cramped human offices he was used to. He was a seasoned diplomat, sure, but even he couldn't deny the knot of tension in his stomach as he glanced at his briefing. Today was a big day. The Rascali twins were no joke, famous throughout the galaxy for their unmatched intelligence, charm, and beauty. He had read all the reports. He knew their species' culture was intricate, emotionally driven, and profoundly alien. And the thought of having to play mediator between their warring factions had Max dreading the worst. When the door slid open, Max straightened up. The Rascali twins walked in. Ileana and Lyra. Tall, striking, and impeccably composed, they glided into the room, their movements synchronized as if one being shared two bodies. They wore simple yet elegant attire that hugged their slender forms and gleamed under the fluorescent lights. They weren't just beautiful, they were otherworldly. "Ambassador Max," Ileana said in a voice that sent a shiver down his spine. "It's an honor to meet you." Lyra smiled, her dark eyes gleaming with unspoken secrets. "We're so glad you could join us. We've heard much about your diplomatic finesse." Max smiled nervously. "It's my pleasure, truly. I'm just here to help however I can." They exchanged a glance, one that seemed too deep for mere politeness. Max shifted awkwardly in his seat. "We've been briefed on your mission," Ileana continued, "and we have a very specific request of you." Max leaned forward, trying to mask his unease. "Of course. What can I do to help?" The twins glanced at each other again, a brief, almost imperceptible flicker of something passing between them. Max's heart skipped a beat. Was it just him, or did the air suddenly feel charged? "You see, Ambassador," Lyra began, her voice low, teasing, "our species is in crisis. We need unity, a unity that only a foreign element can bring. We've decided we need to bond with a species that can survive our emotional connection." Max blinked. "Bond? I'm not sure I follow. You mean, emotionally?" The twins nodded in perfect unison, an unnerving display of synchronicity. "Correct," Ileana said, her eyes glinting with something that Max couldn't quite decipher. "We need a human. Someone strong enough to withstand the intensity of our culture's need for balance." Max was about to ask how exactly this would play out when Lyra leaned forward slightly, her eyes now holding his with an intensity that made him forget his diplomatic training. "We need you, Max, to handle both tasks at once." Max frowned, trying to keep his composure. "Both tasks?" "Yes," Ileana said, as if it were the simplest thing in the universe. "You see, Ambassador, the act of emotional bonding is complex. It requires synchronization of minds and bodies. Our species' dual-natured culture demands that we need to merge physically and emotionally." Max nodded, still not entirely sure what was going on. "Merging? I'm not sure I understand. You're asking me to, mediate some diplomatic talks between your factions while, bonding with you?" Lyra's lips curved into a sly smile. "You misunderstand, Ambassador. The bonding requires someone who can help us achieve unity, a union, in the most intimate way possible." Max's face reddened. "Intimate?" His mind raced, trying to keep up with the rapid shift in the conversation. The twins were gorgeous, yes? But he had never imagined unity meant something quite so personal. "Yes," Ileana purred, her voice now husky with an undertone that Max couldn't ignore. "You'll help us form that union, by handling both tasks at once." Max's eyes widened. It was as if the floor dropped out from under him. "Wait. You mean, physically?" The twins shared a brief, knowing glance, and then they turned their gaze back to him, their expressions softening into something almost tender. "Yes," Lyra said, her tone playful now. "You see, to unite our people, we need a human who can survive the intense emotional connection we share, and handle both tasks. You'll need to engage with us on a physical and emotional level, simultaneously. It's the only way we can unite our planetary factions." Max wasn't sure what had just happened, but his brain was racing. Are you saying you want me to, what? Participate in some sort of, ceremony? The twins exchanged another look. Max couldn't tell if they were amused or impatient. Perhaps both. They leaned in closer, and Max's pulse quickened. Yes, Ambassador, Ileana said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. We need you to help us, emotionally and physically connect. You'll handle both tasks. At once. Max blinked again, processing what he was hearing. 1,000 questions ran through his mind. So you're asking me to help us unite, yes, Lyra said softly, her lips curling into a smile that wasn't entirely innocent. In the most intimate way. Max tried to steady his breathing. Okay. I think I understand, sort of. But isn't there another way? I mean, there must be a non-physical, diplomatic method? The twins both laughed, their laughter musical, melodic, but something in their eyes told him it was all part of the game. A game he wasn't sure he wanted to play. Ambassador, Ileana said, you have misunderstood. This is the only way. You, as a human, can bridge the gap between our worlds. We require this connection. We cannot do it alone. You must handle both tasks at once. Max felt the heat rising in his face as the weight of their words hit him. He tried to laugh, but it came out sounding more nervous than anything. I'm not sure I'm qualified for this kind of task. Max's voice faltered as the reality of what was being asked of him sank in. His diplomatic training had never covered this. No one is, Lyra said. That's why we've chosen you. Max rubbed the back of his neck, trying to form a response that wouldn't make him sound like a complete fool. But the words just wouldn't come. Just think about it, Ileana added. Handle both tasks at once. You can help us form this connection. The fate of our people rests in your hands. Max stood up abruptly, his mind racing. He had to get a grip. This wasn't what he had signed up for. I'll need some time to think about this. I'll let you know. The twins exchanged another glance, and Max couldn't help but feel like he was walking into a trap of his own making. Take all the time you need, Ambassador, Lyra said, her smile never fading. But don't wait too long. Max stumbled backward, his brain still trying to process what had just happened. One thing was certain, this diplomatic mission was about to take a very unexpected turn. Max's head was spinning. He had made his way back to his quarters after the meeting, but the words of the Rascali twins were still echoing in his mind. Handle both tasks at once. What did that even mean? He ran a hand through his hair, trying to focus on the situation. He was supposed to be helping to unite two warring factions, not, well, whatever that was. He knew their species had some odd customs, he'd read the reports. The Rascali were dual-natured, and their emotional bonds were intricately tied to their physical connection. It was a cultural thing, where emotional and physical harmony were intertwined in a way humans could barely understand. But the fact that they were suggesting he, a lowly human diplomat, could help them by, essentially, bonding with them, intimately, had thrown him completely off balance. Max couldn't help but think about it. It had sounded almost like a trap, a test, but he couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, they were serious. The twins had seemed earnest enough, and they weren't exactly known for playing games with their diplomatic dealings. Still, he couldn't imagine they meant what they'd implied. Could they? As he sat on his bed, Max tried to run through the facts. The Rascali twins were asking him to do something personal. Something that seemed to go against every rule of professional conduct he'd ever learned. And yet, there was a certain allure to their proposition. They were gorgeous, yes, but that wasn't it. There was something deeper, something in their eyes, the way they spoke, the way they moved. It was magnetic. But Max knew he couldn't afford to be distracted. He was here to represent humanity. He had a job to do. His mind raced through possible solutions. Maybe there was some sort of misunderstanding? He could have misinterpreted the situation. He hadn't been around many aliens who communicated emotionally to that degree. Perhaps they wanted him to be their mediator in a more literal sense, facilitating negotiations between their factions in a way that involved his own emotional intelligence, not his physical presence. He tried to focus, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the strange request. Handle both tasks at once. What did that even mean in a practical sense? His fingers drummed against the side of his bed as he considered the possibilities. Did they expect him to actually engage in some form of physical intimacy to bring about peace? Was that the cultural solution to their problem? It didn't make sense. But then, nothing about this diplomatic mission had made sense so far. Max's datapad buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up quickly, hoping for a distraction, but instead, it was a message from the twins. They had sent a follow-up, a brief note. We look forward to your decision, Ambassador. We trust you will be open-minded and consider our proposal carefully. Max's stomach sank. Open-minded? Was that what they were calling it? He sighed and rubbed his temples. How had he gotten himself into this situation? The message had been brief, but it wasn't just the words. It was the tone, the implication behind them. They were waiting for him to act. They were waiting for him to choose. Max leaned back, running a hand over his face. This wasn't just about diplomacy anymore. It was about something much more complicated. If he agreed to their proposition, he would be crossing a line he had never even imagined. He was supposed to remain neutral, detached, and professional, but what if his decision wasn't about politics at all? What if it was about something personal? About connecting in a way that defied all his training, all his expectations? The thought of them, both of them, being so insistent, so confident, sent a strange thrill down his spine. He felt the heat of the room suddenly intensify. It wasn't just the air. It was the overwhelming sensation of being caught in something much larger than he had intended. It felt like being backed into a corner, but also like a game, a challenge. The diplomatic training kicked in, and Max tried to remind himself of his priorities. He was supposed to be there for peace, to help with their political struggles. But this was something else. Another message came through, this time more specific. You should know, Max, that in our culture this is the only way. The Union will be our symbol of peace. It's more than just a personal bond, it's a cultural necessity. We cannot do it without you. You must understand this. He stared at the message, digesting it slowly. There it was. The twins weren't asking for him to facilitate some vague emotional mediation. They were asking him to join them in something far more intimate and profound. They weren't just talking about peace, they were talking about union, about connection on a physical, spiritual, and emotional level. A bond. His breath caught. The weight of their words settled over him like a blanket, and the uncomfortable tension that had been building in his chest turned into something else. Something uncertain. Something that made his pulse quicken. It was absurd. Impossible. He was a human. A diplomat, for God's sake. How could he even consider their request? They were aliens, beautiful, fascinating, and entirely out of his league. But the thought lingered, gnawing at him, teasing him with the possibility of something different. Something he couldn't ignore. Max stood up suddenly, pacing the room again. His mind was in chaos. What should he do? What would happen if he agreed? What kind of relationship could this possibly turn into? The idea of rejecting them outright seemed like the safe choice. But would it really be that simple? The consequences of dismissing their request could be serious. He couldn't ignore the political ramifications of saying no. But beyond the politics, there was something else tugging at him, a curiosity, a desire to understand what they were asking, what this bonding truly meant. Max stopped pacing. Maybe he needed to approach this like any diplomatic negotiation, carefully, strategically. He didn't have to agree outright. He could ask more questions, get more details. Find out what was really at stake. Still, the idea of handling both tasks at once kept echoing in his head. It was seductive in its simplicity, yet unnervingly ambiguous. What exactly did that mean? And was he ready for the consequences? Max took a deep breath and glanced at the time. He had until tomorrow to give them an answer. He could sleep on it. Maybe then, things would be clearer. But as he lay back in bed, the thought of those Rascali twins and their confident, enigmatic smiles lingered, like a shadow in the back of his mind. Would he really be able to resist? Max sat in his quarters, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The silence of the room only seemed to amplify his inner turmoil. He'd spent the last few hours going over every possible angle, trying to figure out how to handle this situation. But every thought he had led to the same conclusion: there was no easy way out. The Rascali twins weren't going to let him wiggle his way out of this with some diplomatic jargon. This wasn't about treaties, peace talks, or intergalactic negotiations. This was about something much more personal. Handle both tasks at once. The phrase haunted him, running through his mind like a broken record. What did it even mean? Was this a cultural ritual? A literal request for some kind of physical union? Or was it a test of his resolve as a diplomat? He couldn't decide if he was being drawn into something profound or just caught in the middle of a galactic joke. But the more he thought about it, the more his curiosity grew. There was something undeniably compelling about the way they'd asked. It wasn't just their beauty, or the obvious chemistry between them, it was the sense that they were both completely serious, and that seriousness seemed to blur the line between a diplomatic obligation and something far more intimate. Max rubbed his temples. He'd seen some strange things in his career. He'd mediated peace between rival species on more than one occasion, and each time, he'd felt the weight of the galaxy on his shoulders. But this? This was something he wasn't prepared for. He had two choices. He could decline, maintain his professional distance, and face whatever political fallout came with it. Or he could give in, follow their request, and risk the potential consequences, both political and personal. Max wasn't sure what terrified him more, the idea of crossing that line, or the idea of failing them and potentially jeopardizing an entire interplanetary peace agreement. With a groan, he picked up his datapad again, staring at the message from the twins that had arrived earlier. "We trust you will be open-minded and consider our proposal carefully." It was a simple message, but the words were loaded with implication. They weren't just asking for his help. They were asking for something that felt like it might be beyond the bounds of reason. He exhaled sharply, trying to refocus. There had to be a way to turn this around, to navigate this without falling into whatever trap they had set. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how little leverage he had. They'd made it clear that this was the only way for them to unite their factions. They needed a human, someone with the emotional and physical endurance to endure their connection. But why him? Why a human? And what did it really mean for him, for them, and for the larger galaxy? Max got up and paced the room again, his hands running through his hair. The idea of confronting them again felt like a nightmare, but he knew he couldn't avoid it. The twins had given him an ultimatum, one he hadn't even known he was stepping into. He had no choice but to respond. He grabbed the datapad once more and quickly typed a message, "I'm willing to meet and discuss this further. I have questions. Many questions." He hit send before he could second-guess himself. Minutes later, a reply came through. "We're glad to hear that, Ambassador. Come to us when you're ready. We're prepared to answer everything. You must understand, this is more than just a personal request. This is a galactic necessity, *. Max stared at the screen for a long time, the words blurring together. "Galactic necessity," he muttered under his breath. He'd heard that phrase used in countless peace talks before, but it had never carried this much weight. The Rascali were a proud species, one that valued balance above all else. If they said this was necessary for the greater good, then it probably was. But at what cost? The feeling in his stomach twisted. The more he thought about it, the more everything about this mission seemed to revolve around a very simple but profound truth. The only way to secure peace between their factions was for them to form an emotional and physical connection, a union. And for some unfathomable reason, they believed he was the one to facilitate it. Max sighed deeply. He was no expert in alien rituals or interspecies bonding, but the twins had made their expectations abundantly clear. It wasn't just a matter of diplomacy anymore. It was personal. And that was the part that terrified him. Was he really prepared to walk into their web and risk losing everything he had worked for in the name of intergalactic unity? The thought of actually going through with it left him nauseous, but also intrigued. He knew he had a duty to fulfill, but what if the only way to do that was by abandoning everything he knew about professional boundaries? The idea gnawed at him as he sat back down. He didn't have the luxury of taking this lightly. The fate of entire planets rested on his decision. If he rejected their offer, would it make things worse? Would it doom the peace talks, plunge them further into conflict? What if agreeing to their proposal somehow solved everything? What if it truly was the key to bridging their fractured world? Max's fingers twitched at the datapad again. He typed another message. I want to know more. I need to understand the stakes of this. What exactly do you mean by handling both tasks at once? He stared at the screen, waiting for the reply. Each second felt like an eternity. He had to know what he was stepping into. There was no way he could agree to something so monumental without understanding the full extent of what was required of him. The idea of blindly walking into this situation without knowing the consequences, it was too risky. Finally, the reply came through. It is as simple as it sounds, Ambassador. You will bond with us. Emotionally. Physically. It is the only way we can achieve true unity. You must help us reach balance, the harmony our people need to survive. Max's breath caught. The simplicity of the message was terrifying. There were no ambiguities, no softening of the terms. This was it. This was the task. And if he chose to accept it, there would be no going back. He sat there for a long while, processing the words. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. He wasn't sure what the right answer was, or even if there was one. But he had to make a choice. He could either reject their request and risk everything, or he could embrace the unknown and hope that it worked. Either way, this mission would never be the same. Max took a deep breath. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this. But in the end, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't walk away from it. Not now. Not when the fate of 2 entire factions, and maybe even more, rested in his hands. With a shaking hand, he typed the final message, I'm in. Let's discuss the details. He hit send and stared at the screen. The next move would be theirs. And whatever happened next, he couldn't turn back. Max hadn't expected his heart to be racing quite this much, but as he read the twins' response, something in him clicked. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. The Rascali were serious. And if he was going to do this, he needed to prepare himself, mentally, physically, and emotionally. Though the idea of bonding with them still felt surreal, there was a part of him that was undeniably curious. They weren't just beautiful. There was a force behind them, something magnetic, and he couldn't deny the tension between them. They weren't merely asking for help. They were asking for him to be part of something that transcended politics and culture. Max stared at his datapad, waiting for their next message. The clock was ticking. He had given his consent, and now they had to set the wheels in motion. He wondered what kind of details they had in mind, and how this whole process would unfold. Was there a ceremony? A ritual? Was it as straightforward as they had made it sound, or were there deeper layers to this, more rules and expectations he hadn't been told? Before he could dwell on it any further, the message appeared. We are pleased, Ambassador. Prepare for our arrival. There are few formalities, but this will be a deeply intimate process. We will need you to be fully present with us, and we expect you to adhere to the customs of our people. Do not worry about what you may have heard about our species. This will not be uncomfortable for you. It is necessary, and it will be pleasurable for all involved. Max blinked. Pleasurable, they said. The word had a different weight when coming from them, the twins who had already demonstrated their intelligence, beauty, and perhaps most importantly, their confidence. He felt a strange twinge in his chest. Was that what this was? A pleasure-filled diplomatic mission? Or was there something more to it, something he couldn't quite wrap his head around? He typed a quick response, not wanting to seem too hesitant or unsure. I understand. I'll prepare. The twins' reply was immediate. Good. We will be there shortly. Do not be alarmed by what you may experience. Our culture is different. But trust that everything will proceed as it should. We trust you, Ambassador. Max leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The words were soothing, but they didn't answer the questions burning in his mind. Trust? Trust was easy to extend to someone who had been straightforward from the start. But this situation wasn't straightforward at all. What did they mean by not be alarmed? He had a feeling that whatever they meant by ritual wasn't going to be anything like anything he'd ever experienced before. This wasn't about shaking hands or making polite conversation. It was about an intense connection that would cross every professional boundary he had ever known. Still, he had agreed. He had to go through with it. There was no room for second-guessing now. He gathered his thoughts, trying to shake off the unease. This wasn't just about diplomacy anymore. This was about connection, on a level he couldn't quite comprehend. The Rascali twins weren't simply asking for a favor. They were asking for something that was intimate, personal, and, according to them, necessary for peace. Max rubbed his hands over his face, the reality of the situation settling in. The fate of two factions rested on his actions, and it wasn't about just representing humanity anymore. It was about embodying the very essence of diplomacy, of bridging two worlds. There was no going back now. If he said yes, he was agreeing to become part of their culture in a way no human ever had before. There was no preparation manual for this. No textbook that could tell him what was expected. Max had no idea what would happen when he saw the twins again, when they walked into the room and took things into their own hands, figuratively and literally. He wasn't just stepping into a negotiation room. He was stepping into a deeply personal and emotional experience that would transcend language, species, and everything he thought he knew about relationships. The door chimed. Max's heart skipped a beat, his body stiffening instinctively. He'd been anticipating this moment, but now that it was here, the reality was almost too much to handle. This was it. The twins were here. He stood up, his legs suddenly feeling like lead. His body was on autopilot as he crossed the room, taking a deep breath. When the door slid open, they were there, standing in the doorway like twin statues, so perfect, so poised, and yet radiating an energy that was undeniably human in its allure. Their eyes locked on his immediately, their expression serene, but there was an unmistakable charge between them. Ambassador Max? The first twin, the one with the shorter hair, spoke first. Her voice was smooth, almost hypnotic. We are pleased that you've agreed. Your willingness to help us unites us all. The second twin, the taller one with long, flowing hair, stepped forward. This will not be easy, she said, her tone matter-of-fact. But it will be necessary for the peace of our people. Do not fear. Max felt his pulse quicken as they moved closer, the air between them thickening. It wasn't just about the diplomatic mission anymore. The energy in the room was palpable, something far beyond words. He could feel his earlier nervousness slipping away, replaced by a growing sense of anticipation. I'm ready, Max said, his voice more steady than he felt. The twins exchanged a glance, a subtle flicker of something he couldn't quite identify passing between them. We knew you would be, they said in unison. They were impossibly close now, their presence overwhelming in the best way possible. Their eyes never left his as they stepped toward him. Every part of Max's body screamed to step back, to remain in control, to uphold the professional barrier he had so carefully maintained throughout his career. But another part of him, the part he had never acknowledged until now, wanted to lean into the tension, to see where this strange and exhilarating connection would take him. And then, with no further words, they reached for him. Their hands touched his, their skin cold and smooth, but their touch was electrifying, sending a shockwave through his entire body. He couldn't breathe. couldn't think. All he could do was feel. The room seemed to shrink around them. Time slowed. The diplomatic mission had been a formality. This was something else entirely.